We're jumping right into it. Today's deep dive is on ADP 60, Mission Command.
You bet.
Got your notes here and the actual document.
Excellent.
And we're going to try to pull out the most important stuff for you.
Sounds good.
Think of this as like your cheat sheet to really understanding how the U.S. Army views leadership and control on the modern battlefield.
And it's a hot topic.
Yeah.
Especially now with all the discussion about large-scale combat and near-peer threats.
Oh, yeah. No kidding.
Yeah.
So what strikes you as like the biggest takeaway from this doctrine?
I think what's fascinating is how the document emphasizes the human element right from the start. It acknowledges that military operations are inherently chaotic and unpredictable, which means there's no way a commander can micromanage everything.
Makes sense, especially in today's world with lightning-fast communications and just the complexity of modern warfare.
Exactly, and that's where the concept of optrix stacti comes in, which is all about giving subordinate leaders the freedom to make decisions when the situation changes. You see this reflected in modern military thinking, where adaptability and initiative are prized even in junior officers.
Interesting. So it's not just about following orders blindly.
Right.
You need to understand the why behind the mission and be ready to adapt when things inevitably go sideways.
That's the core of it, and ADP 60 takes this concept and turns it into a full-fledged command philosophy with some pretty clear principles.
Okay, so let's break down those principles. I'm looking at my notes here. The first one is mutual trust. Seems pretty straightforward.
Yeah.
But I'm guessing it goes deeper than just, getting along in a military context.
That's right. You're absolutely right. In the military, mutual trust means commanders have to genuinely believe in their subordinates' judgment, even under extreme pressure. And the other side of that coin is that subordinates need to trust that their commander will support their decisions, even if things don't go perfectly according to plan. It's about creating an environment where calculated risk-taking is encouraged, not punished.
That reminds me of that famous quote by General Patton, "Never tell people how to do something. Tell them what to do, and they will surprise you with their ingenuity."
He was definitely a fan of empowering subordinates. And that empowerment is closely linked to the next principle, shared understanding. How do you make sure everyone is on the same page even when things are chaotic?
Good point. Can imagine that's a challenge, especially in the heat of battle.
It is. Shared understanding has to start long before anyone hits the battlefield. It begins with consistent training, doctrine, and professional development that ensures everyone has a common way of approaching operations. Almost like everyone speaks the same language, even when things get loud.
So it's not just about understanding orders. It's about having a shared mental model of how to operate, how to analyze situations, and how to make decisions within that framework.
Exactly. And this shared understanding is further reinforced by the commander's intent, which is another key principle. It's about clearly communicating the why behind the mission, the desired end state, so that subordinates can adapt their actions to achieve that goal, even if the original plan falls apart.
So if I'm understanding this correctly, commander's intent allows for flexibility and initiative without sacrificing the overall strategic objective.
Yeah.
It's fascinating how these principles build on each other.
They do. And that leads us to disciplined initiative, which sounds like a bit of a paradox.
It does.
How can you have discipline and initiative at the same time?
Right. It seems like those two could be at odds with each other.
It's about finding the right balance. When a subordinate truly understands the commander's intent, they can take initiative within those bounds. They can seize opportunities, adapt to changes, and even make difficult decisions without waiting for explicit orders.
So it's not about going rogue. It's about being proactive and making judgments in line with the bigger picture.
You nailed it. And of course, this all ties into risk acceptance, which is the final principle. Because when you empower people to make decisions, you have to be comfortable with the idea that sometimes those decisions will involve risk.
So under Mission Command, there's an understanding that you can't eliminate all risk. It's about accepting a certain level of risk as a necessary part of empowering your subordinates.
That's right. Commanders have to trust that their subordinates are well-trained and will make calculated risks that are in line with the mission. And equally important, subordinates need to feel confident that they won't be punished for making a tough call, even if it doesn't turn out perfectly.
This makes me think about the difference between simply following orders and truly leading. Mission Command seems to be about creating a culture where leaders are cultivated at all levels, not just at the top.
That's a great observation. And that's where the document shifts to a more practical level, discussing the actual control aspect of Mission Command.
That's interesting because at first glance, control seems to be the opposite of empowering subordinates. So how does that fit into this whole philosophy?
It's not about micromanaging, it's about ensuring that everyone is working towards the same objective, even when they're operating independently.
Uh-huh.
Think of it more like a guiding hand than a tight grip.
Okay, so it's like setting up the conditions for success, providing clear direction, but not dictating every single move.
Exactly. And the document outlines three key elements of control: direction, feedback, and information management.
Let's dive into those. How do commanders provide clear direction without, stifling that initiative we were talking about?
It comes back to those clearly written mission orders. You've got to state the what and the why clearly, but without getting bogged down in the how. It's about painting a picture of the desired outcome and letting your subordinates use their expertise to figure out the best way to get there.
And I imagine feedback is crucial here. It can't just be a one-way street.
You're right. Effective control requires constant feedback from all levels, not just top-down. Commanders need to be actively listening to what's happening on the ground, getting reports from their subordinates, and understanding the challenges they're facing. This multi-directional flow of information allows everyone to stay on the same page and adapt as needed.
Makes sense. So clear direction through mission orders, constant feedback loops. What about information management? How do commanders filter out the noise and focus on what's truly important, especially with the deluge of information available on the modern battlefield?
That's where the concept of Commander's Critical Information Requirements, or CCIRs, comes in. It's all about identifying those specific pieces of information that the commander absolutely needs to know to make effective decisions. Think of it like having a mental filter to cut through the data overload and focus on what will actually impact the mission.
Okay, I'm starting to see the bigger picture here. Clear direction, constant feedback, and a system for managing information effectively. What's the next piece of this puzzle?
The document then dives into the command and control system itself, because it's not just about concepts, it's also about the practical structures that make mission command actually work in the real world.
This is getting really interesting. Tell me more.
Well, the command and control system has four main components: people, processes, networks, and command posts. And each one plays a vital role in making sure that command and control functions on the battlefield.
So you're talking about the human element, the systems they use, the technology that connects them, and the physical locations where decisions are made. Let's unpack each of those, starting with people. Who are the key players in this system?
You've got the commander and their staff, who are responsible for planning, coordinating, and executing the mission. Then you have subordinate leaders at various levels who are actually carrying out those plans on the ground. And don't forget about liaisons, those individuals who act as bridges between different units or even different branches of the military, making sure everyone is communicating effectively.
I bet those liaisons are especially important in joint operations, where you have forces from different branches working together.
Absolutely. But having the right people in place is just the first step. You also need well-defined processes.
Okay, so what kind of processes are we talking about here?
Think of them as the standard procedures that keep everything running smoothly. One example is the military decision-making process, or MDMP for short. It's a structured approach to problem solving that helps commanders analyze situations, develop options, and make informed decisions. It's especially valuable in the chaos of combat, where clear thinking and a systematic approach can be lifesavers.
That makes a lot of sense. But we can't forget about technology. What role do networks play in this system?
Networks are the communication systems that allow everyone to stay connected and share information in real time. We're talking about everything from radios and satellite communications to those super sophisticated computer networks that the military uses.
And I'm guessing those networks are crucial for maintaining that shared understanding we were talking about earlier. Because without effective communication, it's impossible to keep everyone on the same page.
You're absolutely right. Networks allow commanders to quickly share their intent, subordinates can report their progress and any changes in the situation, and information can flow up and down the chain of command much faster than ever before.
So we've got the people, the processes, and the networks that connect them all. That leaves us with command posts. What role do they play in this system?
Command posts are the physical locations where commanders and their staff gather to do their work. Think of them as the nerve centers for command and control. They could be anything from a building or a tent to a mobile vehicle, depending on the situation.
I'm picturing those scenes from war movies, with maps spread out on tables, screens flashing with intel, and personnel coordinating troop movements.
You're not far off. But it's not just about having a physical space. It's about how that space is organized and utilized to facilitate decision-making and make sure that information flows smoothly.
So we've covered the four main components of the command control system. What insights does ADP 6.0 offer on how to actually organize for success within this system?
The document stresses that the chain of command is still critically important. It provides clear lines of authority and responsibility, but it also emphasizes that each commander needs to have a manageable span of control. If you have too many people reporting to a single commander, things can get chaotic quickly.
That makes sense, yeah. Too much for one person to handle and decisions start to break down.
Exactly. The document highlights that the span of control should be realistic, taking into account the complexity of the situation and the capabilities of the leader. It's about finding that sweet spot between centralized authority and decentralized execution. It's a balancing act, especially in the middle of a dynamic operation.
And speaking of balancing acts, the document also talks about the importance of unit integrity. What does that mean and why is it so important for mission command?
Unit integrity is all about keeping units together as much as possible, instead of constantly shuffling personnel between different commands. This helps teams build trust, shared experiences, and that all-important shared understanding we keep talking about. It fosters cohesion and teamwork, which are essential for effective decentralized execution.
So it's about recognizing that teams develop a sort of shorthand, a way of working together that allows them to operate more effectively. Breaking up those teams disrupts that flow.
Exactly. But of course, real-world operations rarely go perfectly according to plan. What happens when communication systems go down or the situation gets so chaotic that units get separated?
That's a great question. I imagine those degraded environments can really test the principles of mission command. Does ADP 6.0 offer any insights into dealing with those kinds of situations?
The document acknowledges that degraded environments are a fact of life in modern military operations. And this is where training and preparation really pay off. Soldiers have to be equipped to make decisions and operate effectively, even when they can't constantly communicate with higher headquarters. It all circles back to those core principles: trust, understanding, initiative.
So it's about instilling a mindset of adaptability and self-reliance from day one.
Exactly. The document makes it clear that technology and processes are important, but the human element is what ultimately makes mission command work. You need leaders at all levels who are empowered to think for themselves and adapt to the ever-changing realities of the battlefield.
That's a powerful takeaway. But before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I'm curious about real-world examples of mission command in action. Does the document offer any specific cases that illustrate these principles?
It does. One compelling example is the story of the U.S. paratroopers who were scattered during the invasion of Sicily in World War II.
Oh, yeah, I remember reading about that. Wasn't that operation plagued by bad weather and a lot of misdrops?
It was a mess. The paratroopers were scattered far and wide, but instead of panicking or waiting for orders, they took the initiative. They formed small, ad hoc units and started attacking anything that looked like it belonged to the enemy. They disrupted communication lines, ambushed patrols, and generally caused chaos.
It sounds like something out of a movie. Did they even know what their fellow paratroopers were doing?
Not initially, but they all had that shared understanding of the overall mission to disrupt the enemy and prepare for the main invasion force. Even though they were operating independently, they were all working towards that same objective.
So their initiative, their ability to act within the commander's intent, actually contributed to the success of the invasion.
It did. The Germans were so confused and disoriented by these scattered attacks that they thought they were facing a much larger force than they actually were. It's a classic example of mission command in action, showing how empowering subordinates can have a huge impact on the battlefield.
Wow, that's a pretty amazing example. I can really see how these concepts from ADP 6.0 translate into real-world effectiveness. It's not just theory. It's a way of thinking that can make a real difference.
That's the great thing about studying doctrine. It's not just about memorizing rules. It's about understanding the underlying principles and how they can be applied in all kinds of situations.
Well said. On that note, let's wrap up part one of our deep dive into ADP 6.0 Mission Command. We've covered a lot of ground, but there's still more to explore. We'll be back soon with part two.
You know that example of the paratroopers in Sicily?
Yeah.
It really highlights how adaptability and initiative are essential in a chaotic environment.
Right.
It reminds me of another situation, actually, where mission command proved to be really crucial, and that was the Battle of Dak 2 in Vietnam.
Doc 2. I vaguely remember reading about that.
Yeah.
That was during the major North Vietnamese army buildup
Yep.
in '67, right? A real test
You
for the U.S. forces.
Absolutely. It was brutal fighting in the Central Highlands, dense jungle, tough terrain. The North Vietnamese had a real home field advantage. They were dug in, waiting for us.
So how did Mission Command come into play in such a challenging environment? I mean, it sounds like the opposite of those
Yeah.
textbook examples of clear communication and maneuver.
Well, that's just it. The U.S. forces, especially the 173rd Airborne, were operating in small, spread-out units, often cut off from direct communication with their higher headquarters.
So like the paratroopers in Sicily,
Exactly.
they had to rely on their own judgment and training
Yep.
to make decisions in the moment.
In the moment.
High stakes,
Yeah.
no room for error.
Exactly. Commanders had to trust their junior leaders to react to enemy contact, maneuver in that incredibly difficult terrain, and basically fight their own little battles while contributing to the larger objective.
That's a lot of pressure to put on those junior leaders. Did they pull it off?
The Battle of Dak Tor was ultimately a U.S. victory, but it was a hard-won one with significant losses. It's a stark reminder that Mission Command isn't some, magical solution that guarantees success. There are always risks involved.
I guess that makes sense. So it's not just about pushing decision-making down the chain of command. It's about having, well-trained, competent leaders at all levels
Absolutely.
who can handle that responsibility.
Absolutely. And that's where those principles we talked about earlier, like mutual trust and shared understanding, become absolutely critical. Without that strong foundation, decentralized decision-making can quickly devolve into chaos.
So Mission Command is a powerful tool,
It is.
but it requires careful implementation and a solid command climate to
Yeah.
work effectively.
Are there any other downsides or pitfalls to be aware of?
Well, one thing the document acknowledges is that Mission Command relies on a high level of trust and competence throughout the entire chain of command. If that trust breaks down, or if leaders at any level aren't adequately prepared to make independent decisions, things can go south pretty quickly. Yeah, I can imagine that. If subordinates, misinterpret the commander's intent or just lack the experience to make sound judgments,
Right.
their actions could actually hinder the mission,
Yeah.
even with good intentions.
Exactly. It's not a foolproof system.
Yeah.
It requires continuous effort to build that trust, to invest in training and professional development, and to foster a culture of open communication and shared understanding.
Okay, so we've discussed the principles of Mission Command,
Right.
the systems that support it,
Yeah.
some of the historical examples, and even touched on the potential downsides. But let's bring it back to the you in all of this. What does this mean for our listener, the military professional,
Right.
trying to apply these concepts in their own career?
That's the key question, right? And I think ADP 60 drives home the point that Mission Command isn't just something you do. It's a way of thinking, a leadership philosophy that you have to embrace and cultivate at every level.
So it's not just about, reading the document and checking boxes. It's about internalizing those principles.
Internalizing.
Yeah. And applying them in your day-to-day interactions.
In your data.
How you train your troops.
Absolutely.
How you communicate with your superiors. How you make decisions under pressure.
Couldn't have said it better myself. It starts with you as a leader fostering that climate of trust and shared understanding within your own unit. You have to constantly communicate your intent, empower your subordinates, and be open to feedback from everyone, not just the folks above you in the chain of command.
And that continuous learning piece is crucial too, right? You've got to be constantly training, developing yourself and your team so that everyone is prepared to make those tough calls when this situation demands it.
Absolutely. The battlefield is more complex and unpredictable than ever before. That's what makes Mission Command so relevant. It's about creating agile, adaptable leaders at every level, not just relying on top-down directives that might be obsolete by the time they reach the front lines.
That adaptability theme seems to run through the entire document.
Right.
Is there anything else from ADP 60 that you found particularly insightful or thought-provoking?
One thing that stood out to me was the emphasis on clear communication.
Okay.
It sounds obvious, but in high-stress situations, it's easy to fall back on jargon, assumptions, or just plain sloppy communication.
I can see that, yeah. When the bullets are flying,
Right.
there's no time to decipher cryptic messages or guess at what your commander meant.
Right. And the document highlights the importance of using plain language, avoiding those insider acronyms, and really making an effort to make sure your message is understood, especially when you're communicating across different units or branches.
So it's not just about talking. It's about communicating effectively.
Precisely. And it goes beyond just the words you use. It's about being an active listener, seeking feedback, and being willing to adjust your communication style depending on who you're talking to and what the situation calls for.
That adaptability piece, again, it seems like it's not just about adapting your tactics on the battlefield, but also adapting how you communicate and lead.
Exactly. And that adaptable communication style is valuable in any context, not just the military.
Now that you mention it, a lot of these principles seem applicable to leadership in general, not just in a military context.
Oh, yeah.
Thinking about unit integrity, for instance, that seems relevant to building strong teams in any organization.
You're spot on. That sense of cohesion and shared understanding that comes from working together over time is essential for any team to be successful, whether it's a platoon or a marketing team.
And that trust that develops within a cohesive unit,
Absolutely.
that's invaluable when you're facing a crisis or a challenge.
Mhm.
It allows people to take ownership, make decisions without second-guessing themselves, and move quickly.
No doubt about it. When you have that level of trust, you can empower individuals to take initiative, make decisions without constantly going up the chain of command for approval. And that leads to greater agility and responsiveness, which are critical in today's fast-paced world.
We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive into ADP 60 Mission Command. It's been fascinating to explore the principles, the supporting systems, the real-world examples, and even the potential pitfalls.
It has. I hope our listeners, especially those in the military, have gained a better understanding of just how complex and powerful this command philosophy is. It's not just about giving orders, it's about creating a culture of trust, shared understanding, and initiative that enables effective action at all levels.
Before we wrap up this episode,
Yeah.
I want to leave our listeners with something to ponder. We've talked about how crucial trust is for Mission Command to work.
Absolutely. Trust is the foundation.
So the question for you, our listener, is this.
Mm.
How can you, as a leader, cultivate that trust within your own team or organization?
What concrete steps can you take to build that foundation of mutual respect, confidence, and shared understanding that will empower your team to achieve its goals? Because that shared success is what it's all about.
Yeah, that's a question worth chewing on.
Big time.
For sure.
Yeah, so-
Because building trust
Yeah.
isn't a one-time thing. It's an ongoing process. And it's even more important now, with the world changing so rapidly and just the nature of conflict becoming more complex.
You're right, the landscape is shifting constantly, and ADP 60 spends a good amount of time addressing the challenges of what it calls degraded environments, those situations where communication is disrupted, information is scarce, and uncertainty reigns. It's the fog of war turned up to 11.
So how do you even maintain effective command and control when you're operating in those conditions? It sounds like a recipe for chaos.
That's where the real strength of those mission command principles shines through. When you've built that foundation of trust, shared understanding, and disciplined initiative, your team is much better equipped to handle whatever curveballs come their way.
So it's about creating that resilience, that ability to adapt and make sound decisions, even when you're cut off from higher headquarters or facing, totally unexpected situations. You're almost baking in the ability to operate independently.
Precisely. You're empowering those subordinate leaders to really own their missions, to understand not just the what, but the why, and to act decisively within the commander's intent, even when the situation is changing by the minute.
Speaking of changing situations, it struck me that this idea of adaptability is a huge theme throughout ADP 60. It's almost like a mantra for modern military leadership.
It makes a lot of sense when you consider the nature of modern warfare. Technology is constantly evolving, new threats emerge all the time, and the battlefield itself is more complex and unpredictable than ever before. Rigidity is a recipe for disaster.
So how do you build that adaptability into your command structure? How do you create a military organization that can not just react to change, but anticipate it and even drive it? That's a tall order.
One way ADP 60 addresses this is by emphasizing the need for a culture of learning and innovation within the Army. It encourages leaders at all levels to question assumptions, experiment with new approaches, and be willing to throw out the playbook when the situation demands it.
That sounds like a major cultural shift for a large hierarchical organization like the military.
It is, but I think it reflects the recognition that clinging to outdated methods or rigid command structures just won't cut it in today's world. To stay ahead of the curve, the Army needs to be as agile and adaptive as the adversaries it faces.
I'm starting to see how Mission Command goes beyond just a tactical doctrine. It's a strategic necessity for the military to stay relevant and effective in the 21st century.
Exactly. It's about developing a force that can operate across the entire spectrum of conflict, from large-scale combat operations to humanitarian assistance and disaster relief and everything in between.
And it's about empowering leaders at all levels to make decisions that align with the military's core values and its mission to defend the nation. It's about developing those critical thinking skills and that sense of ownership that goes beyond simply following orders.
That's a great way to put it. Mission Command isn't just about winning on the battlefield, it's about building a stronger, more adaptable, and ultimately more resilient military force that's ready for whatever the future holds.
Well said. We've really dug deep into ADP 6.0, Mission Command, exploring the principles, the systems, the historical examples, and even those crucial questions about trust and leadership.
It's been a fascinating discussion. If you're in the military, I encourage you to read the entire document and think about how you can apply these principles in your own career.
And even if you're not in the military, I think there's a lot to learn here about the importance of trust, adaptability, and empowering people to take ownership of their work. Those are valuable lessons for any leader in any field.
Absolutely. Whether you're leading a team on the battlefield or in the boardroom, those principles can make all the difference.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll be back soon with another exploration of a fascinating topic. Until then, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep leading.